All right. I am now joined by my friend and comrade and occasional co-author, Matt McManus, who teaches politics at Whitman College, is the author of a bunch of books about postmodern conservatism and other subjects. How are you doing today, Matt? Uh-oh. Is Matt having connection problems? Oh, no. Let's try taking him out of the stream and putting him back in, see if that helps. Matt! Where are you, Matt? Let's see. There we go. You back?
Excellent. Yep.
Right. Outstanding. Yeah. Don't know what was going on there, but yeah, let's get right to it. So this is this debate. This is a classic debate from 1965. So right in the civil rights era, between William F. Buckley, who was, of course, the founder of the National Review and a big influence in the American right wing in the late 20th century, and James Baldwin, who I think maybe we mostly remember as a novelist, but spent a lot of time speaking out about stuff like this. And the topic, I guess the first thing to say about it, and then I'll throw it to Matt, see if he wants to say anything about it before we actually start the debate. Start watching the debate. Is that the topic? It's one of these things that I think it's like a little bit too like literary for its own good, because it's a little unclear what it actually means. But the way the topic is framed, like the proposition, I think this debate happens at Oxford, is so there's like a proposition they're debating, and it's, is the American dream failed the American Negro, which I guess could be taken a lot of ways. It's certainly a I think that one simple way of interpreting it is just like, is American society circa 1965 incredibly racist, which has the virtue of being obviously true. Another way it could be taken is, I don't know, that like somehow living standards or some benefits of American society for other people are at the expense, are only possible because of the mistreatment of Black Americans, which is less obvious what to say about that. At any rate, like the subtext for a lot of what you're going to watch is that Baldwin obviously was a huge supporter of the civil rights movement, and Buckley not so much. Right? So Buckley, as hard as this is to remember, because Buckley's the voice of mainstream conservatism, in fact, is often given credit for like kicking the John Birchers out of the conservative movement. So it's kind of the guardian of like mainstream acceptability and conservatism. But he was very much against the civil rights movement at the time. That like you can read old National Review, certainly I think there's an unsigned editorial in the National Review, but whatever, he's the editor, and he let
the 1957 piece is usually the most infamous one, because it was called Why the South Must Prevail, and it includes ruminations that have aged very well, like for the moment the white race or the white civilization is the superior one, so we need to take a kind of patrimonial attitude towards our lessers.
Yeah, right. So it says that so the line that they would take is that white people in the South are at least somehow culturally superior or better educated or more capable of self-government, and so it's actually good that that Black people, for example, were stopped from voting in states in the Jim Crow South. And I know Buckley did recant some of that, but decades later, when it would have been impossible not to, when you would have been just run out of mainstream politics if you didn't. So this was certainly his line at the time, and you kind of, I think knowing that helps make it a little bit clearer what they're arguing about. All right, let's get right to it. Yep. Here, let me share screen.
I also want to say Buckley did later recant Buckley later recanted some of his more extreme anti-civil rights rhetoric, but he never quite recanted.
Okay, so I might have actually been
1960s. He was talking about why it is that MLK was basically being impolite.
Yeah, right. So and certainly, even if he had already recanted his opposition to integration and voting rights for Black people in the South, which I don't think he had yet by the late 60s. I think that was much later. But even if he had recanted that, then I'm sure he would have been like deathly opposed to everything that MLK was spending the last few years of his life fighting for. Which like whatever. Certainly, if you at least American public schools in the era when I was going through them, were pretty vague about this. So, they tended to skip straight, like, Martin Luther King Day assemblies and things like that, which, they did have, where I grew up in the North. But they tended to skip straight from the March on Washington to the assassination. And they also didn't tell you the March on Washington's full name was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, or that was heavily sponsored by the UAW. And they certainly didn't tell you about the Freedom Budget, which was like extremely ambitiously social democratic, or the Poor People's Campaign that he was spending the last couple of years of his life organizing. You might have gotten the stray fact that he was killed while visiting striking sanitation workers, but there were certainly no connections made about what was going on there. And you certainly never heard the word Vietnam in any presentation on Martin Luther King, even though that was like a hugely controversial part of his political life and his ministry. And at the very end there in 1968, and really what turned a lot of his former liberal supporters against him, that he gave this speech saying that we were fighting a murderous imperialist war in Vietnam, and we're on the wrong side of the revolutions of barefooted people around the world. And he wouldn't speak out. He wasn't prepared. He thought that if he was going to condemn the violence of the desperate in ghettos, he had to, condemn the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, which is the U.S. government. So obviously, you never heard about any of this stuff. That speech, by the way, if anybody wants to look it up, is called Beyond Vietnam. So certainly the point just being that even if William F. Buckley had come around on integration and letting everybody vote, which, spoiler, he does equivocate on an interesting way about, he kind of fudges the issue a little bit in this debate. There's no way in hell he would have come around to any of the rest of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that people also don't teach about MLK is, of course, that in a speech to his staff, 1968, he said, we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move towards democratic socialism. Maybe isn't, of course, an emphatic endorsement, but he's certainly flirting very heavily with the idea that things as they are right now aren't right, and that just fixing institutional barriers to voting participation, while an absolutely necessary step, particularly for historically marginalized people of color, is by no ways sufficient in order to achieve a just society.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's, he actually, I think MLK made quite a few statements like that, scattered around various letters and other things where, it was always a little vague, I don't think he necessarily spent a ton of time thinking about the sort of, nitty gritty of what kind of economic organization he'd like, but he'd make, he'd use phrases like that one, some kind of democratic socialism, a lot, that, he certainly had the sense that, that something, was fun, like that there was something fundamentally unjust about American capitalism that no amount of Great Society programs could fix.
Absolutely. If there's one person I'm not going to pick on for maybe not thinking about the economy as much as you should, it's all be MLK, since he was a busy guy. He had a lot of things to do. So
right, his hands were full for sure.
Yeah.
See, by the way, that someone suggests in the chat for one of the future installments of this, we do Hitchens versus Hitchens. So there's a couple of debates that Christopher Hitchens had with his brother Peter at the end of Christopher's life, which actually would be good ones because they're both very short, and those would be fun for sure. Peter Hitchens, people don't know, I mean, Christopher, of course, was a lifelong socialist, although he took a very bad turn on foreign policy at the end, and also an extremely adamant secularist, obviously. And his brother Peter was this like extremely devout Anglican Tory who wrote a book called, I think, The Broken Compass, that Christopher Hitchens says in his memoir Hitch 22. Contained assertions so reactionary that he felt the need to wear a garlic necklace to read it. So that gives you some idea. But so yeah, for sure that one will be in a future installment. But let's get right to it. So there's some introductory speakers and stuff, but let's just pick up where I think Baldwin here is about to start.
Oh, just for the listeners, can we get we should just give a little bit of context. This is 1965, and I think it was at Oxford University, right?
I believe so, yeah. So let me see if it says it's. Oh no, Cambridge, but yeah, same idea.
Cambridge, yeah, okay.
Yeah, same difference. The old money. Elite private university, or whatever. Not exactly.
One of those schools that looks like Hogwarts in the United Kingdom. Yeah.
Yes, precisely. So let's do it.
It is now with very great pleasure and a very great sense of honor that I call for Mr. James Baldwin to speak third to this motion.
Now we have Mr. James Baldwin, the star of the evening, who has been sitting, listening attentively, getting a wonderful reception here in the Cambridge Union. Tremendous enthusiasm from all sides of the House for Mr. Baldwin.
Tremendous enthusiasm.
The argument. Now we'll bring the voice of experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on an effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl, that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another.
Can I just say something here?
Now what happens when that happens?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, just because it's the opening thing, and I just think it's remarkable because almost anybody who has ever done debate, and I used to do it back in high school, and I don't really enjoy it all that much. I haven't for a long time, but I tell you, start small and kind of build your way up, so that you end on a big closure. And it's just remarkable that he has the audacity and the ambition, not to mention the confidence, to start by basically challenging the entire vision of reality, not just of sharecroppers, but of Western or European civilization. And you have to have a lot of passion and a lot of conviction in order to do that, and to pull it off as successfully as he does in this, right?
Yeah, if you're going to start out with by attacking Western civilization, what's the close going to be?
Yeah, and people's whole conception of reality, right? And he's absolutely right to do so. It's just it's just such a fresh thing to see in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, he's not, especially because his audience here, like the obvious way to pander to them would be to say that this is something that's like, okay, in this like backward area in the American South, where like they're uncivilized, they're doing this, and instead it's like, oh, yeah, I mean, they got it from you guys. This is a much bigger problem. It's linked to, like French imperialism in Algeria and, all these other things. I mean, it's just like, there's definitely some, like he said, at the very least, he's confident enough that, that he's willing to just bite off all that right at the very beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper.
Line in the debate.
That the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you.
He speaks like a novelist also, right? You can really tell that he's a literary author, right? Because he's really evoking this kind of subjective experience of how it is that you conceive your identity.
For sure.
And accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now, we're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroad.
That one especially has to hurt for Buckley.
Yeah.
For nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In another way, this dream, and we'll get to the dream in a moment, is at the expense of the American Negro. You watch this in the Deep South in great relief, but not only in the Deep South. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady or the girl at the Western Union desk. And she doesn't know quite who she's dealing with, by which I mean that if you're not part of the town, and if you are a northern nigger, it shows in millions of ways. So she simply knows that it's an unknown quantity, and she wants to have nothing to do with it. So she won't talk to you. You have to wait for a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We've been through it. And by the time you get to be a man, it's very easy to deal with. But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is is in some ways much, much worse. This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, but in 1965, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world. And it is perfectly true from the point of view now simply of an American Negro. Any American Negro watching this, no matter where he is, from the vantage point of Harlem, which is another terrible place, has to say to himself, in spite of what the government says we can't do anything about it. But those are white people being murdered in Mississippi work farms, being carried off to jail. Those are white children running up and down the streets. The government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. I hate to sound again like an Old Testament prophet, but if the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason for believing the civil rights bill will be honored now. And after all, one's been there since before, a lot of other people got there. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? And I suggest further that in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, what I always felt when I finally left the country, found myself abroad in other places, and watched Americans abroad. And these are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know, when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except another black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it was some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African, and you will see what I mean. My grandmother was not a racist. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also as a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person if you've got absolute power over that person. It seemed to me when I watched Americans in Europe that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of bland ignorance, condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they'd always patted me on the head and called me shine, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walk out of Harlem, ride out of Harlem downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously can pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home. And it would seem then, of course, that it's an act of God, that this is true, that you belong where white people have put you. It is only since the Second World War that there's been a counter-image in the world. And that image not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and Africans had to be dealt with in a way they'd never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created, and will create, a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, that is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized. And we can talk to each other at least on certain levels. So that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement.
I mean, that was a pretty good prediction at the very least.
Yeah.
They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation and in spite of the Johnson landslide is that one has been betrayed by American politicians for so long. And I am a grown man, and perhaps I can be reasoned with. I certainly hope I can be. But I don't know, and neither does Martin Luther King, none of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says, and don't entirely believe anything I or Martin say. And one can't blame them. You watch what has happened to them in less than 20 years. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, this is my last point, which had Negroes in it for a very long time. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able, in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course, the Negroes hate it. Presently, the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, a more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it does mean now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
So I had completely forgotten. I've seen this before, but I'd forgotten that line about the labor movement. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I just want to say two things about this, because I've never watched this debate in full. I've seen significant parts of it at different points and seen it dissected, but I decided to just, kind of wait for an opportunity, and this arose. But one of the things is that he really does display like a capacity to weave different things together, particularly the very subjective and the personal, and the universal philosophical and the timeless, in an extraordinarily artful way that testifies to his literary genius. And there's very few people I can think of who would be able to do that as successfully as he does here in this debate. And it shows a real mastery of his craft. And a lot of people aspire to this and aren't able to reach it, right? The second thing that I kind of thought was interesting here is that twice in the debate, he does actually do something that's quite dangerous, which is talk about the impact of segregation and racism on the white population. Both when he talks about the sheriff and how it is that this is impacting his kind of moral outlook about the world. And then later on, of course, when he's talking about the danger all this animosity will pose to Western civilization as a whole. And in a lot of cases, this might be taken as pandering if somebody who is a lesser individual was doing it, right? Be like, well, you're trying to cater to your audience in order to get them to sympathize with you and realize like you have a stake in this as well. But what he was doing actually, I think, is really pointing out and that the damage being caused to the population was a moral and a spiritual one, right? It was really corrupting them from the inside. And this was something that needs to be criticized, but also pitied. And a lot of people wouldn't be able to pull this off successfully, but he's so rhetorically powerful and intelligent in the way that he breaks this down that it doesn't just come across as convincing, but actually edifying, to use his terms, right? Like you really feel like you have to do something about this because a great wrong has been committed, which everybody is culpable and which everyone is a victim, particularly people of color, but also the victimizers. And it's going to take a long time to expunge that kind of sin.
Yeah, and it's interesting again, like that he's, yeah. So I mean, like the overall case he's making here, and I guess this is important because we started out by saying that the way the debate topic is phrased is so sort of, literary, and and not that it's not obvious, like precisely what that means. But it seems like certainly at least the way that Baldwin seems to be taking it is American society, and he's also tying it into Europe and European imperialism elsewhere, is distorted through and through by the oppression of Black people. That seems to be his big, that seems to be the way he understands the debate topic. And so in making that case, I think he's trying to show how that's bad for everybody involved. So like the first several minutes were spent explaining how it's bad for its most direct and obvious victims. What it's like to to realize that you don't have this kind of like basic civic equality, that the society, that the country you've pledged allegiance to has not pledged allegiance to you. That you're sort of locked out of the way the culture understands itself. That's that part about how watching Gary Cooper kill the Indians and realizing that you're the Indians, and certainly in more material ways, which he kind of gets into in various ways, like throughout his opening presentation when he talks about hyper exploited Black labor literally building the country in the first place, and when he talks about not being served at the Western Union, all that stuff. Yeah, exactly. It's like that skit, "Are we the baddies?" But then also that it's bad for, and also that it's bad for different kinds of white people in different kinds of ways, right? That it's bad for the Alabama sheriff who's being asked to use brutal violence to enforce this system. And also that it's bad for regular American working people. That line in passing about the labor movement. So in the case of the sheriff, it's bad for his soul. In the case of American white workers, the suggestion in passing, at least, is that it's bad for their pocketbooks. But because he develops the thought a little bit. He says because you're told that however bad you have things, right? At least you're not Black. So which is a sort of classic kind of suggestion. It's very similar to the W.E.B. Du Bois' line about the psychological wages of whiteness, which is I think often a little misunderstood, because what Du Bois meant by it, I think, is closer to the use that Baldwin was putting it in here than it is to a lot of contemporary privilege theory, because Du Bois was a Marxist. He thought that like this was fool's gold, that people were accepting these psychological wages over real wages, and it was in their interest to not do that. And I think that's what I think that's what that line about the labor movement and all of that is kind of suggesting. Chomsky versus Foucault, for sure. We should do that sometime. Fun fact, by the way, about that Chomsky-Foucault debate. Somebody mentioned in the chat. Foucault was apparently asked the organizers to pay him in hash, and so then later for however long it took to smoke it all, he and his friends joke about how they're busting out the Chomsky hash. I don't think Chomsky knew that that's how they're paying Foucault, but
hey, whatever works.
Yeah, for sure. But that would be a thing.
I just wanted to say one thing before we move on to watching Buckley a bit, which I have a sneaking suspicion I'll enjoy less.
Sure.
Which is that people really talk about how people ask a lot of times, like, what makes a deep person, deep-souled individual. It's kind of an old-fashioned rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to give a definition here because I'll be caught into it, but to a certain extent, one's capacity to reflectively associate with other people and to understand things from their standpoint without necessarily agreeing with them is probably a part and parcel of that, right? Because you kind of hold more realities, to use Baldwin's term, in your mind, right? And he's really capable in some ways of empathizing, not just with the victims of oppression, but clearly with the victimizers, right? And seeing things from their standpoint, and has therefore a much more holistic vision of how it is that the world operates. And I think that's one of the reasons this speech has the kind of power that it does, right? Because you get the sense that you're listening to somebody who's not just really thought about these issues politically, but deeply understands what they mean to people in the most fundamental way. And that's a very rare ability to convey, even in a novel, let alone a 15, 20-minute speech, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That he's, and it comes across, right? I mean, so it's like you pointed out earlier, it's very novelistic. He's really, he's not doing a 10,000 feet kind of statistical sort of view on this. It's full of sentences that start with I. It's about what the experience of not being served at the Western Union, and the experience, for that matter, of being dehumanized by carrying out violence against people who are protesting for their rights. Would be like for somebody, which like you said, the kind of breadth of the vision there is really impressive. But like, he's also, even though he's doing it in this very novelistic way, I think there's actually, obviously the philosophy nerd in me wants him to spell out a little bit more what he means by system of reality and all that stuff. But it's still like, there's like a pretty tight and pretty clear line of argument here, right? Like that hey, is this, I'm saying that American society is poisoned by the treatment of Black people in America, and this is fundamentally unjust. It's fundamentally bad for everybody. So I'm going to talk about the ways that it's happened economically, right? He's going to do that in that novelistic way. I built America. I did the railroads, all that stuff. But that's what he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about the cultural dimension, realizing that you're not really considered to be part of the society. He's going to talk about what that does to the psyche of somebody who's growing up under it. He's going to talk about what that does to the psyche of somebody who's carrying it out. And he's also going to, again, it's very artful. It's just in passing. It's like 10 seconds. He's going to talk about what that does to all the people who are taught to identify with a ruling class that they're not part of, because of racial prejudice.
Yeah, and like what struck me is how very near the beginning he said, like, we're not going to look at the numbers about this, right? We should, but we're not going to. And then, like you said, he really talks about this from various different subjective standpoints while generalizing out from subjective to the intensely universal, right? And lesser disputants, like myself, I should say, would really want to lean on those numbers, right? We want to point out, like, look at, the different ways that these people have been marginalized economically. Look at how it is that they're penalized by the prison system. Look at the way that this has impacted, the American society when it comes to combating wars. Just listing off all these figures, right? And then a constant onrush. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? The numbers tell a very powerful story. But again, it takes a great deal of confidence in your ability to understand the standpoints of other people and the broader philosophical and aesthetic dimensions of what's going on, to come in and just refrain from doing that and give the kind of argument that he did, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Clearly I'm right there with you. Look, I actually did do a debate. When was this? Like a month or two ago, with a right-wing YouTuber about called himself Mr. Reagan, about whether racism was still a significant social problem in the United States, and that was exactly the approach that I took in there, right? I just I basically tried to be really careful about the definition, and then I dumped a bunch of studies on him, and I think that in some contexts, there's probably something you can say, for that approach, especially when you're dealing with somebody who is going to try to present themselves as being like very hard-headed, and that like and present anybody who disagrees as just being overly emotional. But
facts don't care about your feelings kind of crowd.
Yeah, exactly, right. That like if what they're expecting and maybe even kind of hoping for is that you'll just break down and yell at them that they're a racist, that like I think there's something that can be very effective about that. But also, goddamn, I mean, if you can do what James Baldwin does, do that.
Yeah. Well, not all of us are James Baldwin, right? So we do what we can, with what we have. That's for sure.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, speaking of not all of us being James Baldwin, let's watch William F. Buckley.
There we go. I agree with one of the commentators. So Buckley versus Chomsky and Chomsky versus should definitely be on the trajectory.
Sorry, what was that?
I was going to say I agree with some of the commentators that I'm James Baldwin. Thank you, this quick. Buckley versus Chomsky and Chomsky versus Foucault should definitely be in the timeline, I'd say, for your show.
Oh, Chomsky versus Foucault, and what was the other one?
Oh, Buckley versus Chomsky.
Oh, Buckley versus Chomsky. Oh, right. Yeah, the best of enemies stuff. Yeah, that'd be kind of fun. We should, yeah, definitely. Which is where he's on much better behavior comparatively speaking to the Baldwin debate.
Oh yeah.
He in the Chomsky one, he famously calls Chomsky a queer and threatens to punch him in the mouth. He manages to keep it much more under control here.
Yeah.
Tremendously moving.
Oh shit! What happened there?
I mean, the Journal of Enormous Merit would probably be pretty interesting also.
They didn't have any.
All right, let's try this again. Man, at least the next thing that was going to come up on my YouTube was Matt Christman. That could have been so much worse.
And I'm very grateful and very pleased to be able to call on Mr. William F. Buckley, Jr. to speak forth to this motion.
Now we have Mr. William Buckley, who will need all his skill to establish a ascendancy over his audience, which has clearly been so deeply moved.
Thank you, Mr.
by the
President.
eloquence and
Baldwin.
personal experience of the preceding speaker.
Take our Griffith, gentlemen. It seems to me that of all the indictments Mr. Baldwin has made of America, here tonight and in his copious literature of protest, the one that is most striking involves, in effect, the refusal of the American community to treat him other than as a Negro. The American community has refused to do this. The American community, almost everywhere he goes, treats him...
Just because people are asking about what Buckley was famous for, it was for founding the National Review after he wrote a book called God and Man at Yale, which was basically the foundational text of the Young Conservative Coast University, deals with a lot of left-wing professors and doesn't like that kind of genre.
Commands the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that
Buckley was
sit here
independently
and
wealthy.
your retarded types.
Yeah, no, I think he came from money. I think, in fact, I think his dad, if I'm remembering this right, may have been involved in the oil industry.
Not sure. I mean, he went to Yale in the 1950s when, that was still considered like an old boys' school. And mannerisms, kind of give them away that way. Not that we should, commit like an ad hominem by suggesting that. But,
yeah. Okay, so I just looked it up. William F. Buckley Sr., right? Of course, this William Buckley is William F. Buckley Jr. So his father was an American lawyer and oil developer. He became influential in Mexican politics during the military dictatorship of Victoriano Huerta, but was later expelled when Alvaro Obregón became president. He became wealthy due to his interest in oil exploration and speculation. So, which makes sense, I've got to say. I actually did read Buckley's first book that you mentioned, God and Man at Yale. I try to make sure I don't do it at anything like the pace that you do, but I do try to make myself take in a conservative book a few times a year at least, and that one is interesting. Like the last conservative book I read before that was Ben Shapiro's The Right Side of History. So certainly after that, like Buckley's such a better writer than Shapiro is that, it was kind of fun to read just for that alone. But it's also a really interesting book because later books in that kind of genre that you're talking about, the sort of like, young conservative went to college and, hated the leftism, genre, take a very different line in some ways, because a lot of the later ones really frame it as colleges are these like oppressively liberal institutions that people aren't exposed to conservative point of views, or there isn't free speech or something like that. And Buckley, it's almost the opposite. God and Man at Yale is explicitly a call for censorship that he wants, at the very least, I don't know if he'd want government involvement to do this exactly, although also he did defend the McCarthy hearings at one point, so maybe he would. But at least in that book, right, that he wants Yale to fire all of its professors who have who he suspects of having atheist or socialist leanings.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Nathan Robinson wrote a really good piece about this recently in Current Affairs, where he pointed out that there's this kind of reputation of Buckley as the good conservative, the one who would have leftists on firing line and would actually argue with them, and he was relatively polite and he actually took left-wing ideas seriously. And to be fair to him, that's all true. But when it came to his actual substantive views, the guy was fucking rotten to the core in a lot of ways, right? Rotten to the absolute core, and in some ways he held views that were vastly more aggressive than even a lot of the Trumpists today.
Oh no, totally. I mean, he was opposed at the time to the civil rights movement and recant till way later, as has already been mentioned. But also, I think there was a point in the 80s when he or National Review was floating the idea that that like men with AIDS should be like branded in some way, so everybody everybody would know. I mean, just crazy shit like that. And also, whatever he may have taken back about the civil rights movement didn't stop the National Review from supporting, apartheid South Africa in the 80s. So, I'm sure their line about that was that it was, this was this like American ally that was under threat from communists and, whatever. But, when push came to shove, they did always take that sort of side.
Exactly, right? I mean, if you're a reactionary with a thesaurus, I might enjoy reading your stuff more than I will reading, Ben Shapiro or Dinesh D'Souza. It doesn't mean I respect it anymore from a moral or political standpoint, right? So Man at Yale, better book than like 90% of the young conservative, goes to college campuses in terms of its literary value. In terms of substantive value, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, by the way, what really hit me as I kept reading this is, goddamn, I wish I'd been going to Yale in the 1950s, because the economics classes that he got to take there sounded way more interesting than what I got to take as a graduate.
Apparently, according to him, economics at the time was entirely peopled by Marxists and Keynesians. The Keynesians were the fringe, I'm not entirely sure that's true, because Buckley probably has a very generous appreciation, so I would say, of who counts as a Marxist or not. But certainly it sounded a lot more ideologically diverse than what you get in a lot of economics departments today. So yeah,
exactly. And even even taking into account that I'm sure he's cherry picking like hell, it's like, oh, that's cool. Like imagine going to college, when there were actually, there was actually like an interesting range of views, in the economics department. And, there were people who were, there were things in economics textbooks that were, talking about the advantages of redistribution. That sounds way more interesting. But yeah, and then right. Obviously, in general, I don't know. It's just interesting that Buckley is so openly opposed to the idea that college, like you think one of the oh, sorry. Wait, who did Bhaskar debate? I missed something in the comments, but anyway, but yeah, that like some of this stuff at least sounded, some of the stuff he's describing, if not exactly, Marxist, at least sounded like sort of robustly Keynesian to the point of verging on like proto MMT. And again, like that's just, that's just way more interesting.
Well, things are improving, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I always point out that like back when I took my econ classes, I guess in 2006, way too long ago now, right? Like the idea that Thomas Piketty would become a bestseller and publish a book on why it is that we need global wealth redistribution and something would have been shocking to everyone in the department. They probably would have told you it was more likely to be destroyed by an asteroid. So no, incremental improvements. That's what I always say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Fair
I'm gonna
enough.
grab another drink. So I'll be right back.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the debate that Bhaskar did with Nick Gillespie, who's the editor of Reason, and there was also another Jacobin debater and another National Review debater. The other Jacobin debater was Vivek Chibber. The other National Review debater, I do not remember off the top of my head, but yeah, I actually thought that was a fun debate. I thought that was like, I thought it was pretty substantive. That I like that they got into Kant a little bit. So it was interesting. Yeah, Bhaskar did debate Gene Epstein. Fun story about that, by the way. I had when I debated Gene Epstein, which was summer of 2019. I'd watched, like I obviously watched Epstein's debate with Bhaskar, as part of my preparation for it. And I also sent Bhaskar a DM. I was like, oh, hey, I'm about to debate Gene Epstein, any thoughts, any tips? Or I think I was about to send him that message, maybe. I don't remember if I actually sent it and then realized that he wasn't going to get back to me, or I just, I was about to send it. Then I saw that he'd like just posted on Facebook that, he'd gotten engaged like that night. And I was like, okay, he's probably not going to take time out to share debating Gene Epstein tips. But yeah. So let's all right.
I'm back.
Let's go back to William F. Buckley.
And lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, or that we have no ideals. That our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast in the United States with a kind of
Buckley doesn't choose to give way. The interrupter must, and he has done. The interrupter now said that.
Goes beyond anything that was ever expected from the most servile Negro creature by a Southern family. I propose to pay him the honor this night of saying to him, Mr. Baldwin, I am going to speak to you without any reference whatever to those surrounding protections which you are used to in virtue of the fact that you are a Negro. And here we need to ask the question, what in fact shall we do about it, Mr. President? What shall we in America try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations which I join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination.
Shout out somebody in the chat says it really is something for Buckley to accuse anybody else of being affected in their speech.
Yeah, no kidding, eh? Oh boy.
We found it a source of considerable mirth to laugh away the statistics of my colleague, Mr. Murford. I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material progress. It is, in fact, the case that 7/10 of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States.
Hold on, I missed something. Now let's watch that again.
In America, try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations which I join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination. You found it a source of considerable mirth to laugh away the statistics of my colleague, Mr. Murford. I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material progress. It is, in fact, the case that 7/10 of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States. This is a capitalization that was not created exclusively as a result of Negro travail. My great-grandparents worked too. Presumably yours worked also. I don't know of anything that has ever been created without the expense of something. All of you who hope for a diploma here are going to do that at the expense of a considerable amount of effort. And I would thank you, please not to belie the fact that a considerable amount of effort went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American Negro than that is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race.
That's a little bit more of a blatant appeal to people's kind of class interest, right? It's like, well, all of you are getting a degree here and you're working hard, so, you know.
Yeah, so that last part. So I think that other than the sort of like blustering about how, quite a way to put it, that he was gonna, who's gonna treat Baldwin, as a white man, and ignore that he was black, and assessing his arguments, which I guess like the implied accusation is that
I think it's even worse to say that he gets all kinds of protections from being right? And that insulated him from normal criticism, and it's like, oh boy, it takes a certain level of both condescension and a tremendous lack of self-awareness to say that, even in 1965. Right?
Yeah. That in 1965, that this was the case. So we're talking about, just as a refresher, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. So in terms of desegregation of public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act, was about the same time. Essentially the right to vote was extended to Black people in the South in 1964, and this is happening in 1965, and he's claiming, in this environment where by the way, right? So, the 1964 general election was LBJ, who himself, by the way, had a pretty mixed history on some of this stuff, but but was pushing through, civil rights legislation at the at that point, right? He had a bad history earlier, and was also, I think, famously not the most, meticulously woke and sensitive person ever in terms of how he expressed himself. But it was LBJ as the Democrat and Barry Goldwater as the Republican, and Goldwater was running, on a sort of libertarian opposition to, forced desegregation, and really aligning himself with people who were actually running, in effect, police states, in places like Alabama, like really to the point where, people were violently attacked, by mobs and by the authorities for trying to exercise their right to vote. There was a really extensive effort at, monitoring and suppressing, civil rights activity. So that's 1964. And 1965 is like, oh, everybody's tiptoeing around you because you're black. Well, I'm not going to do it. That says something.
Well, it really shows you that a lot of the roots of contemporary conservative discourse, whether you're talking about Ben Shapiro or Dave Rubin especially, have deep roots, which is unusual since, of course, a lot of them like to claim that there's some kind of originality involved here and pushing against PC culture and how it was that the left didn't used to be like this. Because a lot of the things that you see conservatives accuse progressives of today have their roots in people like Bill Buckley, right? This argument that campuses are full of leftists and liberals who don't respect conservative positions, that apparently in 1965, one year after you get a government in that actually supports civil rights, it's already not okay for conservatives to speak their mind about race relations, and he's a target and the real victim here, and how it is that everyone at Cambridge has also worked hard, right? And there's an interesting genealogy to be written on that, and his kind of influence on these broader rhetorics.
For sure. I mean, both halves of that. The obviously the campus stuff. He was the big innovator of, and the like the way that he's talking about. Well, I'm not gonna like coddle you and tiptoe around you just because you're black. I mean, like there's tons of contemporary conservative rhetoric that's. I mean, as 255 AD says in the chat, right? They're saying the same shit now. And then, but then his other argument at the end, so his argument just before we paused is one that more directly engages with what Baldwin actually said, but it's also like a remarkable argument that because Baldwin spent all this time talking about the various ways in which various people in American society, most obviously black people, are adversely affected by by the racial oppression of black people, and Buckley's saying, oh, but come on, black people in America have a higher standard of living than 95% of the world, so what are you complaining about?
Yeah, exactly. We give you 2/3 of what a white person would earn, right? Why are you complaining?
yeah. Which is
meritocracy and the Protestant work ethic, right? But
yeah, and then that last. So the implication is like right again, like I just can't get over the fact this is 1965. American democracy, in a very real sense, started in 1964, right? This is 1965, and he's saying everything is fine now. But it's also like, I mean, this is just classic Tukokwe stuff, right? That the whataboutism, that it's like, okay, so sure, black people in America are a little bit worse off than white people in America, but hey, whatever, people in the third world are even worse. So it's like, sure, true, not at all relevant to what's being debated.
No, absolutely, right. And I mean, this is one of the points that conservatives tend to make quite frequently, which I think has a very easy rebuttal, which is that, look, we're not saying that there aren't worse situations that people could find themselves in right now. What we're saying is that they could be in a better situation, and that the resources are available to change things for the better, and that's what we should be doing. It's a very simple argument, right?
Right,
in some ways.
exactly.
not to invoke him too often, but Nathan Robinson made that point again very nicely in a current affairs article from 2019, where I think he was responding to it might have been Charles Murray, right? But the point is that it's like, look, sure, people here are a little bit better off than they are elsewhere, right? But that's not what people are frustrated about. What they're frustrated about is the systematic racism and the tremendous injustice associated with that. And the fact that he thinks that it's appropriate to even argue that, well, we give you 2/3 of what everyone else earns is kind of shocking in some ways, right? Not to mention it runs very contradictory towards a lot of the principles that he himself has espoused in many other instances about the value of hard work, how we should treat people as individuals, how it is that you should pull yourself up your bootstraps and merit what it is that you get.
Yeah, well, it's also just so obvious that I mean, this is always the sign of a shitty argument. That the form of the argument could be turned around and it would work just as well, or really just as badly, in the other direction. Because look, if you're going to say, oh, Black people in America are still better off than people in most other countries in the world, then therefore, why are you complaining about unequal treatment of white and Black Americans? Look, you could do the same thing for say, hey, why are you complaining about this sort of mild redistribution of great society programs and some rudimentary social democracy? You could be living in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that would be a funny one, actually. I'm surprised nobody brought that up at the time.
But yeah, it'd be the same, be the same argument, like it's, and if you could, if you can see why one of those is illegitimate, you should be able to see why the other one is. Oh yeah, the point just before we paused was when he said, I take it this is his response to what Baldwin said earlier about how I built this country, all this stuff, when Baldwin is speaking in a poetic way there about this about hyper exploited Black labor, originally slave labor, but even then later with the railroads and all that, severely underpaid labor of second class citizens, was used to build up the country and create this bountiful economy that people are locked out of the full privileges of. And that's what I guess he thinks he's responding to with this business about how, well, my parents worked, everybody's parents worked. What are you talking about?
Exactly. I think it's a real testament to what Wendy Brown talks about in her new book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she points out that a lot of conservatives, oddly enough, Christian conservatives, like to invoke this Nietzschean point about ressentiment, which is kind of weird if you think about it, right?
Right.
To be invoking, the death of God guy in order to make an argument, but never mind. And one of the things that she points out is that Nietzsche always assumed that resentment would come from people at the bottom towards the top. He never really intuited that people at the top can be extremely resentful of those at the bottom, and I think you see that manifested dramatically here, right? Where it's saying, well, yes, we may have denied you citizenship, and we might have denied you equal wages, we may have denied treating you like a human being, even throughout most of our history. But nonetheless, we got some things, and we work really hard also. So why is it that you're trying to take our privileges away from us? And then he even gestured to that again when he pointed out to everyone in the room that, well, you're all Cambridge grads, you're working hard for your degrees. Why should you feel bad when these people are trying to attack you, right? If anything, you should feel a certain animosity towards people like him for trying to imply that you don't deserve to be here, or that this is some kind of unearned honor, right? And
yeah, again, it's just remarkable, like, that this is literally a room full of the most both culturally and economically privileged people on the planet, right? These are students at Cambridge, one of the two most really like traditionally literally aristocratic, and then only figuratively so universities in the UK. Like right at the heart of of world capitalism at a time when when colonialism, like literal colonialism, hadn't yet ceased to exist in the way that it has in most of the world. It had started to, but it's still very much ongoing. As that reference to France and Algeria, reminds us. But yeah, right, exactly. Half the students probably went to Eden, and so. And so when you just think about that, right, it's like, oh, well, you're all, you worked hard to get here. You're going to work hard. It's like, well, okay. Like, there's working hard and there's working hard. Like there's literally nobody in this audience who's ever going to have a job that doesn't involve like sitting at a desk and, you can take as long a lunch as you want.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And I mean, somebody's asking about the Nietzsche point, and I'll just go on this really quickly, and then maybe we should watch the rest of it, because I am actually curious to see how this ends, since, again, the whole thing. But it's just a reference to Wendy Brown's book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she points out the unusual fact that a lot of conservatives like to invoke Nietzschean points about ressentiment, right, that the poor or the victims somehow resent their oppressors. And it's this resentment that's really at the root of most forms of progressive politics, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, when people make this charge, the idea isn't that like, the poor are resenting the rich because they want more. The idea would be in that example that the poor are resenting the rich because they want the rich to have less. That's like the idea that it's like this kind of like. That it's not really a desire for something for yourself, that it's just kind of a spiteful resentment.
Exactly. And one of the things that Wendy Brown points out that I think is really brilliant is she turns this argument on its head and says, look, throughout history, you can see plenty of examples of the rich, the privileged, the advantaged being tremendously resentful of anyone who essentially calls them on their privilege, right? And they find all kinds of ways to justify their situation while at the same time saying, well, who are you to call me out for what I've done? I've worked hard, I went to Eton, do you know how hard it is to get through that school and then get into Oxbridge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we should never underestimate the capacity of resentment by the powerful to mobilize reactionary forces against people who are really trying to fix a fundamentally unjust world. And I think, again, Buckley is just a spectacular example of this in what we've seen of the debate so far.
Yeah, and I would argue, by the way, that actually there's a lot of contemporary conservative arguments that, because like when you talk about like economic redistribution, like the ressentiment thing is just like obviously kind of wrong, because you think, well, no, people are actually directly benefiting, and that's like really, objecting to poverty, does seem to be a much bigger motivation than objecting to wealth. But also there are a lot of contemporary conservative arguments that really do, like, I think that the glove does fit much better, sometimes directed not towards, like rich people who don't want their privilege to be assailed, but directed to like the sort of divide and conquer, attempts that they make. Like, so just two examples that come to mind. For me are the argument, which the last piece that I had out of Jacobin was response to, that forgiving student loan debt is unfair to people who've paid off student loans in the past, and the argument that's often used, as a conservative opposition to tenure, either for university professors or for, usually for public school teachers. That's usually what they're talking about. That, where they say, well, you don't get this kind of, hey, why should these public school teachers, get this like level of job security and, months off in the summer and all that stuff? You don't get any of that stuff. And it's so nakedly an appeal to that kind of resentment, that it's because there's no hint of a suggestion that somebody who works at a grocery store is going to benefit from public school teachers not getting job security or not getting, vacations in the summer. It's just purely a, fuck them because they have something that you don't.
Well, there's a beautiful example of that recently, just before the election, where Rich Lurie, in the National Review, Buckley's magazine, described Trump as, I quote, the only middle finger available to, progressives. And usually it's not spelled out quite that explicitly, right? But sometimes it is. And when it comes to like the kind of conservative argument, my favorite Marxist, living Marxist, I should say, Frederick Jameson, had a really good reply to that in his book on the political unconscious, where he said, look, a demand for justice and fairness isn't resentment, right? You might think that, people who are at the top are entitled to have a very good life, and they should have a good life like everyone else should. like everyone should. But nonetheless, there are deep flaws in our society, and you might be motivated by love or compassion or humanism, like Baldwin is, right, to try to change the system, right? And I think that's very different than what you see with all the examples that you gave, Ben, where a lot of it really is not motivated by love, compassion, resentment, or desire for justice or fairness, but just a big fuck you to the people at the bottom, right? Like, don't take my stuff. I need the sense of satisfaction and superiority that I get from this, and I'm not.
Yeah, or even an appeal to people at the bottom that they should feel resentment toward the people who are just above them but nowhere near the top.
Yeah.
In order, again, obviously, to have this kind of divide and conquer strategy, which. Although, I will also say that I think that there are smarter and less smart ways to respond to some of this stuff. And
absolutely.
I think that a smarter way to respond to it than some of the strategies we've seen would be to really emphasize, like, hey, we want to get rid of student loan debt, but also, right, let's get rid of medical debt and various other kinds of debt that poor people are likely to have. And let's just make this all part of the same program, or like in the teacher tenure and vacation case, like more obviously, it's like, yeah, we should defend this, and we should have this for everybody, right? If you work at a grocery store, you should have job security and and get lots of vacation time, like that. That this is the best way to defend these things. If you're defending these things and you're defending them in a way that makes it seem like you're defending them as special prerogatives for a few people, that's not going to be politically successful. But if you can defend them in a universalist way, say, hey, it's great that some people already have these things, now let's make sure everybody else has them too, that's going to appeal to a lot more people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is why I would say that, like, demands for what I call liberal socialism aren't about trying to bring people down, right, to establish some kind of faux equality. It's about trying to raise everybody up, right? If there are certain kinds of ways of living that offer more opportunities for self-expression, dignity, and a life of fulfillment, and those are available to some, but they're the resources available to make that possible for everyone, that's what we should be trying to do, right? And I think that's sometimes missing in a lot of the conservative criticisms of socialism, who seem to just assume that what we're trying to do is make sure that everyone is waiting an equal amount of time in a line for soup or something like that, right?
Fair enough. All right, let's go.
But even so, to the extent that your withering laughter suggested here that you found this a contemptible observation, I agree. I don't think it matters that there are 35 millionaires among the Negro community. If there were 20 million millionaires among the Negro community of the United States, I would still agree with you that we have a dastardly situation. But I'm asking you not to make politics as the crow flies, to use the fleeted phrase of Professor Oakeshott, but rather to consider what, in fact, is it that we Americans ought to do? What are your instructions that I'm to take back to the United States, my friend? I want to know what it is that we should do, and especially I want to know whether it is time, in fact, to abandon the American dream as it has been defined by Mr. Haycock and Mr. Burford. What, in fact, is it that we ought to do, for instance, to avoid two humiliations mentioned by Mr. Baldwin as being a part of his own experience during his lifetime. At the age of 12, you will find on reading his book, he trespassed outside the ghetto of Harlem and was taken by the scruff of the neck by a policeman on 42nd Street and Madison Avenue and said, "Here, you nigger, go back to where you belong." 15, 20 years later, he goes in and asks for a Scotch whiskey at the airport at Chicago and is told by the white barman that he is obviously underage and under the circumstances cannot be served. I know from your faces that you share with me the feeling of compassion and the feeling of outrage that this kind of thing should have happened. What, in fact, are we going to do to this policeman? And what, in fact, are we going to do to this barman? How?
Fire the cop, find the bar.
Yeah.
are we going to avoid the kind of humiliations that are perpetually visited on members of a minority race? Obviously, the first element is concern. We've got to
It's a very
care
odd
that
neologism,
happens.
right? Minority
We've
race.
got to do what we
Yes.
can to change the warp and woof of moral thought in society in such fashion as to try to make it happen less and less. Let me urge this point to you, which I can do with authority, my friends, the only thing that I can tonight. And that is to tell you that in the United States, there is a concern for the Negro problem. Now, if you get up to me and say, if you get up to me and say, well, now, is there the kind of concern that we students of Cambridge would show if the problem were our own? All I can say is I don't know. It may very well be that there has been some sort of a sunburst of moral enlightenment that has hit this community, so as to make it predictable that if you were the governors of the United States, the situation would change overnight. I'm prepared to grant this as a form of courtesy, Mr. President. But meanwhile, I am saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part a reflection of that concern. You cannot go to a university in the United States, a university in the United States presumably also governed by the Lord Spiritual, as you are, in which Mr. Baldwin is not the toast of the town. You cannot go to a university of the United States in which practically all other problems of public policy are preempted by the primary policy.
It's amazing how much he's attacking Baldwin personally, right? I can't recall
I
any
challenge you to name me another civilization,
Baldwin's presentation
anytime,
where he had
anywhere in
pretty much anything to say about
world,
Buckley.
in which the
No, and he's really like he's putting so much emphasis on like I don't know, like yeah, this is everybody loves Baldwin, everybody's kissing his ass, and I don't, I think the most generous thing you can say about this is that it's not at all clear how this is supposed to, contribute, like back up anything else he's saying about anything.
No, not at all. I mean, all it does is make them seem, ironically enough, given what we were talking about before, mildly envious in a particularly aristocratic way of Baldwin's success.
Yeah, I mean the closest thing to the closest thing to to a way that it's tied into his larger argument is by saying, well, look, the engines of moral concern about this Negro problem are working, and look, James Baldwin is at Cambridge, so so clearly people are concerned about this, which of course the obvious response is okay. Yeah, that's great, right? James Baldwin is at Cambridge, and he's the toast of those parties, New York that the Buckley is talking about. But like, what's going, but also like what's happening to, to Baldwin's relatives, in various parts of the United States, who are not like big famous novelists. And and it seems like if you're going to talk about a general social problem, then you should probably be talking about like how it, like sure, I mean, you should be talking about how it impacts everybody else, right? I mean, everybody that you haven't heard of.
Well, not to mention, to evoke Baldwin's point, the previous 400 years.
That
might be a bit of a stick in his argument. It's like, oh wow, there's this guy, he's at Cambridge and he's the toast of the town. It's like, yeah, well, maybe after 400 years of oppression, slavery, Jim Crow, having one person who is acclaimed might not be a solution to all the problems that have evolved over that period of time.
which the problems of a minority, which have been showing considerable material and political advancement, is as much a subject of dramatic concern as it is in the United States. Let me just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, this. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America. And anybody who tells you that there is a charlatan and ultimately a boring man. Boring precisely because he is then speaking in the kind of abstractions that do not relate to the human experience. The trouble in America where the Negro community is concerned is a very complicated one. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than a purely ideologized interest in the problem
Oh yeah, this is good.
to read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Glaser, also co-author of The Lonely Crowd, a prominent Jewish intellectual,
maybe it's
who
later.
points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is the dreadful efforts to perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of their lack of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is as a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions which were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Glaser considers as relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors in America. In 1960, there were 3,900, an increase in 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Haycock and also by Mr. Baldwin implicitly? No, says Professor Glaser. There are a great many medical schools who are by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and to train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through, but in fact that particular energy, which he remarks was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian-Irish community, for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy, but he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are Negroes themselves. Let me conclude by reminding you, ladies and gentlemen, that where the Negro is concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem is obscured. They have done a great deal to focus on the fact of white discrimination against the Negroes. They have done a great deal to agitate a moral concern, but where, in fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you will read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation that ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro.
What's that?
It's kind of weird the way he kind of like almost holds himself over the course of the debate. But I actually wanted to say that like one of the remarks that he made actually is, it reminded me a bit of Hirschman's The Rhetoric of Reaction, where he talks about how it is that like the solutions to the problems of race relations in the United States are all abstractions and there's no concrete solutions. And that anybody who proposes that there are solutions is, a fool or, just completely naive. And one of the things that Hirschman points out in his book is that this is one of the kind of three classic arguments that conservatives will bring up, right? Either that any kind of thing that you try to do to improve social conditions is just going to make things worse, or that it brings the risk of endangering some previous accomplishment. And then the one that he seems to be invoking most right now is the futility thesis that, well, there's nothing that we can really do that's going to solve this problem. So what exactly is it that you're proposing, right? And it's really quite amazing how this kind of defeatist, pessimistic rhetoric can be incredibly powerful for many people on the political right, because there usually are very clear things that we can do to actually try to improve the plight of people. And giving people the right to vote is a good example.
I'm sorry. Yeah, for sure. Which comes up later. That's the moment I actually thought we were about to watch, but I guess it comes later in the debate. Not that there's much left, but also, it's remarkable that his two examples that he gave when he was, before he goes full cultural essentialist at the end there, and says that that the reason. That there are lots of medical schools that would love to take black med students, but I guess black people just don't want to be doctors, is what it said there. But even And yeah, he starts talking about Bayard Rustin, which is interesting because I think he might be about to connect that with the. Well, I think that's what he's saying. He's being very flowery and unclear, but when he says the radical that that there's a danger because it's so complicated and unsolvable, that Black people will turn towards radical solutions like whatever Bayard Rustin is saying. If you know anything about Bayard Rustin, he's the guy who's behind the freedom budget and and the big sort of turn towards kind of universalist economic demands in the civil rights movement in the mid 60s. So that's what he's afraid of, that people will think, oh, the solution to Black poverty is redistributing wealth, and of course this is a mistake because the solution is somehow getting people to have different cultural attitudes or something.
Exactly what Ben Shapiro says now, right? Why is it that there are so many inequalities in the United States? Well, it's because of culture, right? Particularly amongst minority communities. Why it is that a culture of defeatism and a sense that the system is rigged against you emerged. Not something that Ben is all that interested in, and I'm not sure that Buckley would be all that interested in it either. But it's a very easy way to just kind of whitewash any argument that looks at systemic factors away.
Totally, right? Like, especially because, like, literally what using this word culture lets you do is just say that the explanation for things that seem to have very obviously structural explanations, like why so many more Black people living in poverty than white people after Jim Crow. In the case of this debate, months after Jim Crow, isn't that right? It's just that like a bunch of individuals just individually making bad decisions or not wanting to be doctors or something. And it's also remarkable. I was going to say that when he's doing this, like you were saying, the sort of standards conservative futility thesis, that these things are so complicated and who's to say what could possibly solve them. The two examples he talked about, drawn from Baldwin's life and what Baldwin talks about in his book, were being the subject of police misconduct. And that Baldwin, by the way, this makes me like Baldwin more that he drank scotch, but that Baldwin, ordered scotch.
I'm a whiskey man myself, I'm afraid.
Well, that's a generic, that's a specific kind, but whatever. That Baldwin ordered scotch, unfortunately with water. I guess that makes me like him a little bit less at the airport bar, and they wouldn't serve him. And it seems like in both cases, these things are not actually that mysterious or particularly complicated to solve. These are things with like really clear institutional solutions that they talk about the cop. That's an unarmed agent of the state. And so, yes, you shouldn't have public employees who are able to be openly racially discriminatory, like they should lose their jobs. And yeah, you should have what we actually have now, right? Which is that we've got, we've got state institutions like, equal opportunity employment commissions, various, divisions of civil rights enforcement that would presumably, if that happened today, and it was reported through these channels and they managed to prove that it happened, would presumably, visit that airport bar with a massive financial penalty, which actually seems to work pretty well. Right, like as a matter of fact, despite all of the many ways in which the both ongoing racial prejudice, by decision makers, and also the sort of long-term effects of past legal discrimination, disadvantage Black people in America. It is also true that that if he were alive today, James Baldwin could get served at any airport bar that he wanted, because as a matter of fact, these enforcement mechanisms are pretty effective. So it's really remarkable to see Buckley pull out this dog and pony show about how it's so complicated and mysterious and what could possibly stop things from this being happening. And I guess we'll just have to make people have better hearts. And and just improve culture over time or something. It's like, no, I mean, just like this is all like really basic stuff that can be and has been solved with civil rights legislation.
I suspect that would be too charitable to Buckley, though. I mean, if you actually would say to him, like, well, what if we actually improved, for instance, like educational opportunities and spent some money on that? He probably wouldn't be a big fan of it either, even though that would have a cultural impact, right? But you're absolutely right. I mean, there are all kinds of clear solutions to a lot of these problems. One of the ones that I usually point to is affirmative action programs, right? Like if you're really concerned about the number of doctors who come from historically marginalized people, through the 1970s and the 1980s, a lot of these programs were very beneficial to those groups, right? People were able to graduate from good schools like Berkeley, and the conservative Supreme Court slashed tons of them through the 1980s, starting with the Reagan administration, going forward to this day. And since then, you've seen the numbers precipitously drop. And it's quite remarkable because right around this time was when these programs were instituted. And it's only 15 years later that people like Buckley would say things like, well, we've done enough now to deal with these problems. So time to move on because, of course, now we're discriminating against white people, so-called, right?
Yeah, right. And also, by the way, that's a good general reminder that it's off topic, but it's never not a good time to remind people of it that the liberal cult of the Supreme Court, is really badly misguided because we've got this sort of civics class idea of what the Supreme Court does, that it exists to protect powerless minorities against democratic overreach. And there certainly have been times that's played that role, but those, we both talked to Sam Moyne about this. Those times are definitely the exception. That as often, more often than not, right? Of course, the minority that the Supreme Court is most likely to step in and protect is rich people. But even when it comes to stuff like racial justice, the Supreme Court has insisted, if you're just singularly focused on that Warren Court, that there are some great decisions there, but there's also tons of stuff beforehand that goes in the other direction, and you don't have to go very long afterwards. Like you said, some of these cases were happening in the 1970s when the Supreme Court was actually gutting civil rights legislation and stopping people, and stopping democratic institutions from passing meaningful affirmative action laws.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember what it was that Moyne said exactly in his recent piece on this, but it was something to the effect of, look, the Supreme Court since Marbury has about a 200-year history, 200-plus year history now. 20 of those years were progressive, right?
Right.
So not quite a statistical anomaly, but you're getting pretty close at that point. So if you're putting your faith in this institution to kind of advance progressive reform, might be wiser to hedge your bet somewhere else. And I have to admit, I fell victim to this as well, early, in my career, where I thought the Warren Court did a lot of good things. Maybe courts can actually push society in a more progressive direction. But I think, we've seen, over the last 20 years, especially, with the conservative tilt, that's just not the way to go. And
no, I mean, I think there are structural, I think there's structural reasons for that. I mean, if also, just on a really basic level, I think it's kind of a useful exercise to just make yourself think about this as if you'd never heard of the idea of a Supreme Court before, and you're just hearing about it for the first time. And you say, okay, well, pretty much all these people are going to be Ivy League grads, who went through this whole system, etc. And 9 of them are going to be a super legislature. Undo what real democratic legislatures do. Do you think that they are going to have a particularly progressive impact on the overall direction of policy? And if it was put to you that way, you'd think it was very funny. Especially when you added in the lifetime appointments, because the way social change tends to work, right? If people were appointed decades before whatever political shift came in, happened, they're much more likely to be opposed to it. So yeah, I mean, as Bisquick says in the chat, this kind of council of elders, or always, I almost think of this is the this has been often, especially on economic issues, to economics what the Islamic Guardianship Council in Iran is to religion. That the body that makes sure that you don't get to do anything that would screw with the status quo too much. But all right, we've only got 6 minutes left. Let's just plunge through it and then talk about it. Actually, there is one point there is one point I think that's too good not to stop at, but otherwise let's just plunge through it, and then we can talk about it at the end.
Let's do it.
Than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree.
I was going to say, it's a very nice way of describing an argument that he never made that has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on to your opponent, right?
Except, lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight, I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting.
Yep, that's the moment I thought we were going to get to earlier, which is amazing. So, okay, yes. First, as you say, this attempt to turn it into a resentment thing, and also the cultural essentialism are both really on display in that earlier moment. They're saying, the problem, the thing that, the reason why so many Black people are living in poverty, it's not because of Jim Crow and redlining and etc. It's because it's because of a breakdown of the family structure, which is exactly the kind of thing that you hear from contemporary conservatives. If the only thing that's remarkable about it is that it's been busted out this early, historically. But yes, that was the moment that I kind of teased on Twitter too, when Thaddeus Russell, was giving you a little bit of shit about doing this, when you were like, oh, this is still so relevant, and Russell was like, oh, are there anybody now arguing for segregation? And you're like, no, there are other things though going on in this debate that are still much more relevant. And when I sort of teased in my response to Thaddeus that actually I thought the most interesting moment in the debate wasn't about Jim Crow per se, but about what a non-racialized alternative to Jim Crow would look like, and Buckley equivocated about that. This is the moment that he's saying, "Oh, see, I'm not a racist.
I just don't want anyone to vote."
Yeah, exactly. Like what he's saying, right? Exactly what Nathan says in the chat. That we should be disenfranchising more poor people. I mean, like that's the point, right? That like he,
yeah,
that he wants. That really, that really what he's afraid of is democracy in general, right? And he doesn't want, the poorest and most beaten down people in Mississippi to vote, but he also doesn't want the second most poorest and most beaten down people in Mississippi to vote, because he's worried that any of that stuff would upset the economic apple cart.
Oh, absolutely. And I do want to say, like, that was a remarkable bit of rhetorical interplay there, where he's basically saying that Baldwin was making an argument that he never actually made in order to actually disprove a point that Baldwin never actually tried to make, right? Which is just elliptical to the umpteenth degree. But like, what I find really fascinating about this debate is that a lot of the kind of arguments that you see contemporary conservatives making seem to have had their gestation in these kind of rhetorics, right? And I anticipated this was going to happen because I've read some of Buckley's stuff before, and I knew that he had a big influence on the contemporary conservative movement. But just the weird combination of, like you said, the anti-democratic attitude with trying to portray one's adversaries as basically out of touch, snobs, and elitists, while at the same time being an out of touch snob and an elitist, right? This portrayal of conservatives as the ones who are really the victims here because their adversaries are insulated by political correctness. It's quite remarkable how this prefigured a lot of what we see today.
Yeah, right. I mean, especially because I think somebody who is busting out the contemporary equivalent of, oh, look, everybody's treating, James Baldwin with kid gloves because he was Black. I think anybody busting that out today would say, oh, of course that wouldn't have been true, 50 years ago. But, now. So it's remarkable to see Buckley doing the exact same move.
Yeah, absolutely.
Booker T. Washington said, Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Barnett, Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting, not simply to give the... I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of practice that acknowledges that there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people and brown people and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests, who have, as all of the races in the entire world have, and suffer from a kind of a racial narcissism which tends always to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power. That, yes, we must do. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world today, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society of the United States, in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to adopt the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm that is urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. Because of one thing, I can tell you, I believe with absolute authority, that where the United States is concerned, if it ever becomes a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of idealism, the private stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, we tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprises, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature, and is the generosity, and is the good wishes, is the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie at the reserves of the spirit of the American people. These must not be laughed at. And under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the only alternative to the status quo is to overthrow that civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, the faith indeed of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism must come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, which at that level is indistinguishable, so far as I can see, from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, but we will fight it as you were once recently called to do on beaches and on hills and on mountains and on landing grounds. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging a war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies, just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of a confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage a war not only for whites, but also for Negroes.
Will the fellows take their places, please? They're voted in favor of the motion being that the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. The voted in favor of that motion 544 persons and against 164 persons. The motion is therefore carried by 380 votes. I declare the House to stand adjourned.
It was a very unusual kind of argument, though, because I'm not exactly sure what Buckley was trying to claim at the end of things. I mean, he seemed to close with the argument that essentially, yeah, we've made some mistakes in the past, but we really just think they're being very mean about the way that they're expressing their points, and they should recognize the fundamental decency of a lot of the people who've been engaged in acts of oppression for a long period of time, and then we'll all be better off. And I'm not exactly sure how he thought that would be a winning claim in the 1960s, at the very least.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that what Buckley is actually defending is so bad that even by 1965, you can't quite say it plainly, and like go to Cambridge and then say it plainly. So he ends up having to get incredibly vague at the end.
Yeah.
And because if his big claim, right, like Baldwin's certainly big claim was that the United States has treated black people terribly. That's been bad for everybody in American society. And to the extent that Buckley's claim is no, it's fine, right? Like I think that making that claim, again, like months after black people in the South are granted the right to vote, to use integrated public facilities, like that just sounds ludicrous. So he's saying these vague things about how well, I mean, the most openly racist part of it is which is, I guess, cleverly deflected by attributed to Booker T. Washington, is this thing about how it doesn't matter if black people can vote, it matters if they're ready to vote, and he suggests that its question is not should they vote, but what and of course there's the yes, that's right. Thomas points out in the chat he closed by comparing civil rights activists to the Nazis, which is a bold move, but he said, like he said that thing about being ready to vote, and he said, oh, now they can vote, or we're going to going to help them or we're going to teach them to emulate their brothers in Harlem and support Adam Clayton Powell, who I wasn't familiar with off the top of my head. So apparently Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a Baptist pastor and American politician who represented the Harlem neighborhood of New York City in Congress from 1945 to 1971. He was the first African-American to be elected from New York to Congress, re-elected for nearly 3 decades. Powell became a powerful politician, et cetera, et cetera. There's some corruption issues, but it sounds like that's stuff that happened much later. So I don't think that could be what Buckley is talking about. Says, served as a national spokesman on civil rights and social issues. He also urged United States presidents to support emerging nations in Africa and Asia as they gained independence after colonialism. As chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, he supported the passage of important social and civil rights legislations under Kennedy and Johnson. So I have to say that sounds okay to me, but there's a pretty clear suggestion there that Buckley is making, and this connects to that 1957 Unsigned National Review editorial that you quoted earlier, that somehow culturally maybe black people in the North who could vote already, right, and thus elected this black congressman from Harlem in 1945, weren't ready to vote, that they couldn't use it irresponsibly, so they elected these people who were too left wing. And of course, his big, his big defense against being a racist is that actually he's just a massive elitist who doesn't want most people to be allowed to vote.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think this testifies to a long conservative history about being more reticent about democracy than about liberalism, right? Evan Fawcett pointed this out really well in his recent book, Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition, right? Where he said that many conservatives were willing to make peace with liberalism, as long as it was interpreted in a particularly capitalistic way, right? It's essentially a system where certain people could compete, and the so-called best would rise to the top, and the less effective people would lie at the bottom of the economic change. They were always a lot more reticent about democracy, because democracy would, of course, empower the people at the bottom to try to make changes to that system politically, right? What really struck me about this is this antipathy towards democracy overtly hasn't been shown for a very long time, partly because democracy has become so deeply embedded in our cultural expectations and political institutions that it's very difficult to attack it directly. But Buckley is very overt about that, right? Where he says that, as you pointed out, right, I think the solution to people of color voting in Mississippi isn't to actually disenfranchise them. It's just disenfranchise everybody who's too poor and too uneducated to actually participate meaningfully. So only the kind of people who will give me the results that I want will actually be able to have a political say, right?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, what strikes me about this is that I think some version, without, maybe a non-racist version, or certainly at least a less openly racist version of Buckley's argument, has been resuscitated in the last few years by liberals and by never Trump conservatives, because if you remember, like after Donald Trump was elected, there was this whole spate of articles that would all like quote Plato on the dangers of demagogues winning in democratic systems, and basically suggest that the problem with Trump was too much democracy. That was like a pretty common theme. And I remember one thing that I thought was very interesting at the time. You can actually watch the very first political YouTube video I was ever in was in 2018. I spoke at the responding to Jordan Peterson conference in Ohio, and at the end of the talk, you can hear well, you don't see them, but you can hear their voices, both our friends Derek Varn and our late friend Michael Brooks in the Q&A, and one thing we were talking about in the Q&A was in terms of thinking about like the sort of legitimate anxieties and alienation that drive people to sell what Peterson is buying, and we were talking about how there were even people, well, actually in Buckley's magazine, appropriately enough, the National Review, like Kevin D. Williamson, who after the election, they sort of went on this tear of attacking what they saw as these like dumb white working class people in West Virginia or wherever who'd voted for Trump. Mm-hmm. And in sort of much the same way that conservatives have always talked about black people, that like, oh, the reason there's all this poverty in Appalachia or the former coal country or whatever isn't because of any sort of structural thing that we should solve. It's because of like bad cultural values, which is like that's also, for example, what Hillbilly Elegy is entirely about. So I mean, I think in a way that move that Buckley makes at the end of the debate towards saying, "Oh, I'm not racist," I just have contempt for poor people in general, is kind of, like I think has gotten an afterlife both among Buckley at conservatives, like these National Review Never Trumpers, but also also among some liberals. Like I'm thinking also of like after the election when Hillary said that, yeah, exactly. Thomas Frank has written a lot about this. That after the election, when Hillary said that, oh, I won in all of like the successful parts of the country, that like there's that same kind of suggestion that the people who should really technocratically count, are the ones who, strove and went to college and succeeded, and that everybody else is just some sort of, reprobate loser. And so, I think that the part of Buckley's argument that seems the most dated is the part where he's, the part where he's tying it pretty explicitly to race, but the part that sort of, I don't want to say it exactly holds up, but the part that seems depressingly familiar is this sort of general culturalist explanation of poverty for everybody.
No, absolutely. And I don't want to deviate too far from the parameters of the debate to talk about contemporary events, because that will keep us here for 5 hours, right? But just very briefly, I absolutely agree with you that I think one of the big mistakes that liberals took from the 2016 election and the 2016 Brexit referendum, I should say, was that democracy is a threat and we need to re-entrench various forms of neoliberal anti-democratic policies. Because one of the things that I pointed out is that the reason why it is that people are gravitating towards reactionaries like Trump and towards nationalistic rhetorics more generally is precisely because they feel that the nation state is one of the few forms where they can still have a certain degree of control over their political life, since so much of that has been taken away by globalization. And they feel that the people in Washington or in London or in Paris just don't care, right? Because they're neoliberal technocrats who feel that the people should be insulted every now and then and given two choices about various kind of technocratic reforms, and that's it, right? And I'm very upset about the kind of way that this populist surge kind of expressed itself by turning towards racism and xenophobia. But some kind of reaction against that was inevitable. So I think that as leftists, what we need to do is actually encourage more democratization, but to make sure that it's channeled through the right institutions, and that includes more voices, certainly than the Trumpists are willing to entertain. Since, as we've seen, Trumpist so-called democracy is extremely undemocratic and very hostile to democracy. I mean, they fucking staged a coup, for all intents and purposes in November, right?
Or at least
people.
Incredibly half-hearted attempt to do so, maybe, but yeah. And of course, as somebody points out in chat, like one of the ironies of this argument, that Trump is a symptom of too much democracy, is that Trump lost the popular vote the first time too. And so in multiple ways, Trump is only president because of extremely undemocratic features of our system. So most obviously the Electoral College, but also the two-party system that he, if he hadn't captured, with a plurality, the ballot line of one of the only two parties allowed to participate, then he never would have been in a position to, to come close. Like if there was a, if we had like 3 or 4, major parties, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, he wouldn't have, he wouldn't have won anything. Or if there had been, if there had been ranked choice voting, for example. And of course, also the fact, like, why was it, right? Like the Republican establishment obviously didn't want him to be nominated. But why was it that they let him up on that debate stage in the first place? I mean, he kind of said it at the first debate, that it's because he's given money to every person on the stage. They didn't want to alienate him in the long term, because he was such a reliable donor. And again, why has anybody even heard of Donald Trump? It's certainly not for his insightful political commentary. People heard of Donald Trump because he was famous. Essentially, he was famous for being rich.
Or the graduates of Trump University.
yeah, exactly. Actually, that's true. That's a remarkable way to put it. 255 AD says in the chat, in the last 30 years, the Republican presidential candidates have only won the popular vote once in 2004 at the height of war on terror jingoism. But that's true, right? Because Clinton won pluralities in 92 and 96, and Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000, and Obama obviously won both popular and electoral votes in 2008 and 2012, and Biden did in 2020, and Hillary won the popular vote in 2016. So yeah, the 2004 is the only time in 30 years. That's amazing to think about.
And a number of people have pointed out, though, that would actually make, at the federal level, the Democrats the most popular political party in an OECD country in contemporary times, right? No other political party in any other wealthy country has been able to pull that off. And it's astounding that given the level of confidence and lack of charisma that you've seen in the Democratic Party.
I think that's not, I think that's not really them, it's just that they're, they're competing in an artificially restricted market where most people, do sense that the only available alternative is horrific. Which it really is, right? Like, I know it's sort of you don't, in a sense, like it almost feels, I think to some people, like cliched or boring or lame to, point it out. But, Noam Chomsky is not wrong, when he says that this is, one of the most dangerous political organizations in the world, certainly in terms of, denying climate change, not that the sort of incremental approaches that the Democrats give on that are much better, but, denying it entirely. Certainly in terms of what George W. Bush did, which in many ways, the world has never recovered from. So again, which does get back to Buckley Baldwin, because this kind of open antipathy towards democracy, that Buckley is showing is really something that even before the Republican Party has become quite as consistently minoritarian as it has in the last 30 years, is certainly something that's been a feature of of conservative politics in one way or another, since for a very long time. Even in if you read Rick Perlstein's new book, even in the late 70s, when the Carter administration was toying with the idea of implementing reforms like same-day registration and other things that would make it easier to vote, and there was really a big reaction to that by these kind of conservative mailing list groups, who sensed that they would have a very hard time winning elections if that happened. All of which does make really underline what a mistake it is for people to react or maybe not a mistake from their perspective, but how incredibly counterproductive it is for those of us who would like Republicans to not win any more elections, for some people to react to the rise of Trump with this kind of neo-Buckleyite thing of making these pretentious anti-democracy arguments with Plato or whatever, that because look, one of the best, there are few ideas more popular than democracy. And so if the people that you're running against are going to be more or less openly against that, you're going to want to use that.
No, absolutely. And I think that beyond just tactical reasons, and there are plenty of those, both in the United States and elsewhere, including Canada, where I'm from, right, to want more democracy. But it's also important to stress that as leftists, right, we should be supportive of it in and of itself, because democracy has all kinds of flaws. What kind of democracy you're looking for. Obviously, that can be open to debate. Whether we want a representational democracy, a direct democracy, some kind of hybrid model. Sure, we can have all these discussions. Actually, I have a piece coming out in Jacobin not too long from now that discusses this, where I propose a bunch of direct democratic measures that I think should be implemented in a variety of different countries. Doesn't matter. But procedurally, this notion that everyone should be able to participate in politics and to have a say in the laws that govern them, I think that's an incredibly powerful idea from a normative perspective. Not just procedurally, but in terms of the fundamental principles of justice that we see.
Yeah, if you're going to be required to follow laws, then you should get a say in informing them. I think that's a pretty morally intuitive idea to most people. Thank you so much, Matt. We are going to be doing this every Sunday. Next week, I don't know, maybe I'll get Gene Baudulin to come on to do one of those Hitchens ones where they talk about Iraq. But I hope that I can get you back in maybe a few weeks, and I think you might be a fun person to do that Chomsky-Foucault one with.
Oh yeah, no, I'd love to do that. I haven't read Foucault in some times. I'm still not sure what's real, apart from going through the order of things. But I'd be happy to show up for that.
Nice. Well, let's do that. The next episode of the podcast premieres here in just about exactly 24 hours at 7:30 Eastern time on Monday. That one has current affairs house economist Rob Larson, who is the author, among other things, of a book called Capitalism and Unfreedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom, in conversation with two of my favorite left-wing popular historians, Matt Karp and Alex Gurevich, both of whom write for Jacobin, and talking about basically the same thing that you and I, our first co-written article, was about the Republican theory of freedom and all that good stuff, sort of going back to the anti-slavery movement and early labor republicanism with the Knights of Labor, and getting into contemporary political debates. And then at the very end for Outlaws and Revolutionaries with David Griscom, we talk about Sturgill Simpson's excellent album Cutting Grass. So again, that's premiering Monday at 7:30 Eastern. Week after that is going to be Amber Frost from Chapo and Natalie Wynn, for better known by the name of her YouTube channel ContraPoints.
Send her my love, by the way. I'm a big fan.
Absolutely, me too. And week after that, Anna Kasparian. I think you could do another libertarian debate. I think Jason Lee Bias still nailing that down. And the week after that, since I mentioned at the end of the episode, but I guess this is first time I've done this mention on the YouTube channel, is going to be Slavoj Žižek. So really looking forward to that. Yep.
Wow.
So,
congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah. No, really looking forward to that conversation. And again, we are going to be doing this, with various guests every Sunday. Definitely, Matt's going to be back. We just decided for Chomsky Foucault. Definitely going to do both of those Hitchens versus Hitchens debates. There's a treasure trove. I don't think we're going to run out of stuff that we want to do anytime soon. If you like the work we do here, you can possibly swing it. Please do consider joining the Patreon for the monthly cost of a milkshake at the 50s Diner in Pulp Fiction. Get early access to every episode, Discord server, the regularly scheduled Discord office hours group voice chats, and going to start doing some bonus episodes. If you can't do that, I certainly understand. I've been there. Please do at least like and subscribe here, and rate and review wherever you get to podcast. These things really do help. But I will see you guys in recorded form tomorrow night. Thanks everybody for showing up and commenting. Thanks, Matt, for coming by. All right, left is best.